Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'm so sorry to interrupt the great dinner conversation. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to see the great turnout of peers, friends, family, and of course, faculty to support our graduating seniors. I know this is a super busy time for everyone, so we really appreciate the effort to come out. Blood, Spotify, narco-terrorism, mysticism, Civil War anthems, Mongolia, identity, energy, nationalism, women, law, and literature, in Victorian England, to boot. These seniors have studied it all and more, applying everything that they have learned in class and in the field. Our seniors put their heart and mind into this capstone project, and we are so proud. The students presenting tonight are just a very small sampling of the amazing work that goes on at the college. And our students, supported by the amazing, committed, and dedicated faculty. Actually, faculty, can you please stand up and be recognized? The faculty make it all possible for these students to thrive and to become successful and be the people that they're going to become, and we're all so grateful for you. Finally, before we move into the program, I just want to acknowledge a few other students in the room. I want to acknowledge our outgoing Athenaeum Fellows, Bruno Yoon and Hamsa Shrikant. Please stand up. They have been amazing. They have transformed the Ath with their innovative ideas, their humor, their goodwill, and I am so grateful to them. And then I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome our incoming Athenaeum Fellows, Sophia Krivatsi and Lale Ahmed. Please stand up and be recognized. These women are going to rock the house next year, so make sure you come very, very often. Okay, with no further ado, I think that's the expression, Lindsay Burton.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lindsay Burton, and I'm a dual major in Government and Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm excited to start you guys off this evening. So I decided to write my thesis as a policy proposal, and the title of my thesis was The Convergence of the War on Terror and the War on Drugs, a Counter-Narco-Terrorism Approach as a Policy Response. So a little bit of background on me before we get started here. So I've been an Army ROTC cadet for the past 4 years. Thank you. And so for that means I'm going to be commissioning as an active duty officer in the U.S. Army post-grad. And before we continue, I also want to make the statement that all of the opinions and thoughts shared this evening by me reflect me and only me, and not the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. I actually had to say that. So given that I'm planning to dedicate my post-grad career from CMC to the active duty Army, I've always been really interested in questions of national defense. So those interests have taken me to some really fun places. So in the spring of 2017, I worked for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And one of my projects while I was there was researching the global illicit amphetamine trade and the role that Hezbollah played in that trade. And so that's a perfect example of something called narco-terrorism. And so I decided to take this topic back and deconstruct it within my thesis. So what does the thesis explore? It explores the emergence of narco-terrorism, and narco-terrorism, as the Peruvian president Fernando Terry once described, is the union of the vice of narcotics with the violence of terrorism. So terrorist organizations and narcotics traffickers will form relations in order to benefit one another. So terrorist organizations will protect drug traffickers, while drug traffickers will actually provide a source of funding for terrorist organizations. So they enter this cooperation in a symbiosis, and this symbiosis can actually become so powerful that the two threats will actually begin to hybridize and become one threat in of itself. We'll also look at case studies in Colombia and Afghanistan. We'll discuss how and why current U.S. policies are ill-equipped to respond to narco-terrorism, and then I'll leave you with policy recommendations. So in the identification of these two threats by the United States, we declared the war on drugs during the Nixon presidency and the war on terror post 9/11 to delineate between these two threats. And to address these two threats, the U.S. formulated counterterrorism operations and then counter-narcotics operations. And these mission sets now span over 30 government agencies and bureaus. So how did we get here exactly with defining and delineating two threats and then looking at this as a multi-step process? So during the Cold War, we had an overhaul of our national security strategy in order to address a stable, well-defined, and existential threat, which was the rise and expansion of the USSR, the Soviet Union. And so the result of this overhaul during the Cold War led to the national security strategy, a change in national security strategy from the 1980s until now that is inherently neo-realist insofar that it recognizes state actors as existential threats. And so now this Cold War style of our policymaking process hamstrings the United States to address more nuanced and numerous threats by non-state actors, namely those such as insurgents and drug traffickers. So we'll look at these two case studies. So we have in Colombia, the FARC and their affiliation with cocaine traffickers, and in Afghanistan, the Taliban and opium traffickers. The FARC in Colombia, so the FARC emerged out of a conglomerate of insurgent groups in the 70s, and to grow, the FARC turned to militarily gaining control of parts of the narcotics trade. And in order to address this growth of the cocaine trade within Colombia, the U.S. first turned to counter-narcotics operations. So those U.S. counter-narcotics operations were successful insofar that they were able to dismantle regional cartels. However, by dismantling regional cocaine cartels, that provided space for the FARC to continue to spread and gain influence, allowing the cocaine trafficking to continue. So then the U.S. turned to counterterrorism operations when those counter-narcotics operations failed to address this symbiotic relationship. So we deployed military advisors and contractors and other military assets for crop eradication and human rights programs, but this still failed to target the symbiosis. So the FARC now controls 60% of the cocaine trafficking today, and now they're hybridizing. So in this picture in the foreground, you can see a new FARC recruit. I said a new FARC recruit, and how he's learning to operate his assault rifle, and he's donning a new uniform. So you can see this this digitized uniform here that he's sharing with a couple of other individuals in this photograph. And it's the same one that's shared by the Virgilio Peralta Arenas Bloc, which is a cocaine trafficking organization in Colombia. So in fact, we did not defeat the FARC in the early 2000s. The FARC is simply mutating. In Afghanistan, communist expansion in the 70s caused Afghans to turn to opium cultivation to make do. And the Taliban then started to control the country in the 90s. And their control in the 90s allowed for protection of the market, low transaction costs, and market stability for opium traffickers. So with the takeover of the Taliban in the 90s, the U.S. decided to begin Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001 to topple the Taliban. So then we began to focus on counterterrorism operations in the hopes that rooting out the Taliban would also root out drugs. So the U.S. did successfully topple the Taliban, but narcotics continued to thrive off of a power vacuum in a symbiosis of the de facto. Afghanistan now produces 80% of the world's opium, and there is a resurgence of Taliban popularity to counter Western crop eradication. So what are some key takeaways from these case studies? So in both cases, the U.S. geared all DoD, DOS, and intelligence community assets to focus on one mission set, to then fail and to then revert to a different mission set and fail again. In the Colombia case study, the U.S. focused on counter-narcotics, then counterterrorism, and now there's a hybridized new generation FARC threat. In the Afghanistan case study, the U.S. focused on counterterrorism and then counter-narcotics, and now there is a reformed partnership between the Taliban and opium traffickers to allow Afghanistan to be the chief export of a major narcotic. So what are some proposed solutions to how to eradicate the symbiosis? So one of the options that the scholarly community has looked into is the eradication or repression method. And this posits that the U.S. itself or an entity that it chooses to support will have to force a repressive regime over a finite and bordered space. As you would imagine, this method itself is not very popular, and in other cognates in the past has not worked out well for the U.S. So a different approach would be the alternative livelihood approach, and this is one that the U.S. is actually pursuing. So this requires U.S. Organizations to introduce an alternative cash crop to localities within affected areas and give them a different option to grow some sort of cash crop beside the drug crop. So in Colombia, the U.S. organizations have been introducing black peppercorn, and in Afghanistan, the U.S. has been introducing wheat. However, this is also failing because the cash crop as the alternative is far less lucrative than the drug crop, as you would imagine. In Afghanistan, for example, a locality can make $3,000 a year by growing opium, but make less than $1,000 a year growing wheat. So what's the issue with these solutions that I've been discussing? So I don't mean to call out the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, in this, but he does represent the current U.S. conventional wisdom of siloing our efforts and choosing either a counter-narcotics option or a counter-terrorism option and hoping that it eradicates the other threat. So I will introduce some policy recommendations here. So for Congress, the establishment of an investigative commission, the organization of a series of hearings, and passing of legislation to require that the executive recognizes the need for a counter-narcoterrorism strategy, and for executive to develop that counter-narcoterrorism strategy and to create an interagency working group to bring all these bureaus together to hone our assets. And so I leave you with this image here to illustrate how we're siloing counterterrorism operations and counter-narcotics operations, and the need to break out of these siloed efforts so that the U.S. can combat the threat of our emerging new insurgent adversaries, because insurgency is not the past, it's simply mutating. And so I'd like to thank all the faces that are in these photographs here, and even the faces that are among me tonight who maybe didn't make these photographs, for supporting me the past few years. I'd also like to thank my family and Professor Jenny Ta. Thank you. And I'll take a few quick questions. Counter-narcoterrorism. Boom, okay.
What were the main sources that you relied on for your study? Did you conduct interviews or rely on archival sources?
Right, so I ended up choosing to go with the Colombian case study and the Afghanistan case study because those sources are older, I guess, in a sense. It's harder to look into the Hezbollah one right now because it's still happening right now, and it's being discussed within Congress. I used a series of sources, mostly the United States Department of Defense sources, FBI sources, DEA sources, as well as other secondary sources such as like the Council for Foreign Relations and the like. Not included in this talk is the literature review in which other scholars also discuss the theories that are associated with the narco-terrorist strategy and the like, but mostly U.S. Sourcing based on the fact that I provided policy recommendations for the United States. Thank you. Cool, all right, thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Becky Shane. I am a PPE history dual major with a human rights sequence, and I wrote a philosophy thesis called The Importance of Cultural Identity to Liberal Democracy. Before I start, I would like to say a few thank yous. First to Priya and the ACT for hosting me. Also to my two faculty advisors, Professor Hurley and Professor Sinha, for their support and guidance throughout the thesis process. Lastly, I'd like to thank my family and friends for everything throughout all of college and life, I guess, more generally. And specifically, I'd like to thank my parents and Beth and Joanne for coming out to Claremont and hearing my talk today. So since it's a philosophy talk, I wanted to have slides that had more detail so that you could follow along. So I started with presenting my research question. And my research question asks, how fundamental is cultural identity to an appropriate understanding of equality and autonomy, two core commitments of liberal democratic theory? So what this question is kind of getting at is, do members of a minority culture in liberal democracies enjoy the same rights as members of a majority culture? How does minority identity affect how citizens enjoy democratic rights? So in order to approach this question, I first looked at what democratic theory provided the most comprehensive framework for looking at ideas of rights more generally. So for that, I landed on Corey Brettschneider's value theory of democracy. And Brettschneider's value theory is the most comprehensive because of the way that it locates the democratic ideal in both substantive and procedural rights. What this means is that citizens are able to participate in the democratic procedures while still having their substantive rights protected. The way that he develops this theory is by grounding democracy in what he calls the core values. These core values are equality of interest, political autonomy, and reciprocity. Within those, he requires that citizens are able to have their voices equally heard by society, make their own choices, and deliberate in a way that they could reach these rights. And he upholds these through a justification of state coercion called democratic contractualism, which is a classic take on on social contract theory, which is this idea that you give something to the state in order to get some protection back. So while I think that the value theory is a very comprehensive model for the state, what my thesis specifically looked at is then what does this mean for identity? And ultimately, the value theory cannot take claims of identity seriously. And the first critique that was lodged against the value theory came from Chris LeBron in his book, The Color of Our Shame. And in this book, LeBron argues that different social groups within the United States specifically have this unequal social value, where institutionalized racism specifically makes formal and informal inequality affect groups in ways that these formal rights can't actually be enjoyed by all members of society. So he says, ultimately, if the value theory is going to focus on this idea of equality and deliberation, this de facto inequality in informal institutions will still persist, and therefore the value theory cannot be enough by simply justifying reasons for rights. And by extending this argument, I bring in Tommy Shelby's argument that he presents in his book, Dark Ghettos, where he focuses on positive aspects of marginalized identities. And his argument against forced residential integration says, if you're going to focus on the fact that these identities are marginalized, you still need to recognize the need to protect and secure these identities. So in the case of forced residential integration, he argues that forcibly removing black citizens from their communities into predominantly white societies is framed in a way where it will provide them greater economic opportunity. Yet, this still removes the cultural security of the context of the ghetto and therefore undermines the self-respect of these citizens. So more generally, I extend this argument to say that the value theory, as it is originally presented by Brettschneider, cannot actually make the core values attainable for all citizens. Specifically, equality of interest may drown out minority rights. If everyone has an equal say, naturally, those with fewer votes will not have their votes and voices appealed in society. Further, if you're autonomous, you're making choices, you're only making choices from the options that society deems valuable. And if you're living in a society with a majority culture, those cultural values are affirmed to have greater significance than those of minority culture. So are you actually making a decision if the decision is influenced by greater power structures that deem your cultural values less significant? And further, within this idea of reciprocity, deliberation may drown out the minority rights once again. So to patch up this hole within Brettschneider's theory, I turn to Will Kymlicka's discussion of liberal identity. And he basically says that liberal theory, including Brettschneider's theory, already have these commitments to self-respect and dignity. Yet they don't always explicitly address identity, and that can be a problem. But he's basically saying they have this framework in place, and the best way to rectify it is by providing special citizenship and political rights to these members of a minority community in order for them to secure and nurture their identity. He discusses this within the context of special voting rights, special land rights, and what he calls polyethnic rights. For example, one of the cases that he discusses is the need to have French language schools in Quebec, even though that's not the majority language of Canada more generally. It's necessary for the cultural security of the Francophone community. So once I understand Will Kymlicka's theory to apply to liberal theory more generally, I apply it to the value theory specifically. Because these legitimate claims to minority rights are necessary to uphold the core values, especially for citizens of minority culture. And that way we can understand that by allowing for special citizenship rights for members of a minority community, they will actually get the autonomy and equality that Brettschneider seems necessary. In this way, cultural membership is a condition for self-respect, and therefore a necessary condition for self-government as well. Going off of that, I say that this reimagined value theory can address the critiques lodged against Brettschneider as I presented earlier. If you are providing special citizenship for members of a minority community, this inherently attempts to rectify the power inequality that exists between citizens of a minority and a majority culture. Further, this resulting secure cultural context is giving people genuine options to make choices. It's showing that all cultural values are equally valuable, and therefore the options and the choices that you're able to make are actually genuine choices. So the overall framework that I hope to get at with my theory is then how to look at policy in a democratic state generally, and in this case within a value democratic state. So what democratic theory then best equips citizens to ask questions about justice, but also provides them the tool to correct injustice? And I argue that the value theory provides both the ability to ask these questions and the framework for providing the answers because of the way that it embeds citizens in the democratic process while also securing their protected substantive rights. Brett Schneider argues that you create and judge policies whether or not they uphold the core values. Yet, as originally presented, the core values may be unattainable for members of minority culture, and therefore policies that may actually follow a just model within Brett Schneider's original theory may not actually be just for members of a minority culture. Therefore, the amended value theory actually provides the best framework for equipping citizens to judge policies and have the democratic participation to create the solutions. So I also would just like to conclude that I believe that the amended value theory provides the most meaningful framework for designing policies upholding the core values because of the way the core values respect the self-respect, dignity, and therefore self-governance of citizens. Thank you. I'm not sure how we do questions. Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
Hey, I was just wondering how you settled on that specific research question. What brought you to delving into that?
Yeah, so I did a year-long thesis, but spent basically the entire fall semester settling on a research topic. Because as many of you know, I really liked reading Amartya Sen's Development as Freedom in my PPE seminar in the politics section. And one of the best discussions actually came from Blake, who's sitting over here, who brought up ideas of cultural context and what culture then means for implanting democratic institutions on other societies. So this question was kind of getting at the relationship between culture, identity, and democracy more generally. And I kind of wanted to pair that with these larger conversations that are had in public policy generally about this idea of identity politics and what that actually means within the framework of democracy. So I think I kind of just settled on this topic because working with Professor Hurley, I was reading a bunch of different identity-based theories, democratic theories, and neither of them seemed to be in direct conversation with one another. There were theories that focused specifically on identity and theories that focused specifically on democracy, but neither in direct conversation. And the two theories that I focus on within my thesis, Brett Schneider's democratic theory and Kymlicka's theory of identity. Kymlicka has this framework for policy recommendations, but one of the things that didn't really make sense to me is he kind of just said, here are some frameworks about policy, but he doesn't have any framework in place for how to encourage citizens to adopt those policies, why those policies would manifest in a specific society. And on the other hand, Brett Schneider's theory about having citizens involved in the policy procedures and participation in the creation of policy didn't actually have any specific answers for what types of policies would come out, only just how to judge those policies. So it seemed to me there was kind of this gap in how to put these ideas in conversation. Thank you.
Cool. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful Wednesday night. My name is Brendan Suh. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a senior, obviously. I dual major in PPE and economics, and I wrote my economics thesis on Spotify, generally. I was curious because I love music a lot, and I was looking for a way to blend my interests with music for my interests with economics. And with the help of Professor Aviv, I kind of came up with this topic because I was very interested in asking the question, what makes music popular, especially on Spotify, because streaming platforms are just building in relevance. And so this was kind of my quest to find the secret formula to building the perfect song. Didn't quite get there, but there's some interesting insights, I think. So we'll delve into it. Also, this will have a little bit of music. Just want to preface it because I can't have a thesis about Spotify and not play music during my presentation. So we will get going. So I start off my thesis presentation with, oh, I don't think the audio is working. Oh, very quietly, nice. All right, I start off my thesis with this quote by Taylor Swift. She says, "Music is changing so quickly, and the landscape of the music industry itself is changing so quickly, that everything new, like Spotify, feels to me like a bit of a grand experiment." I'm gonna pause here really quick. So I use this somewhat absurd quote at the beginning of my thesis because it reminds us and it grounds us in how absurd Spotify is and how disruptive it was to the music industry more generally. Because gone are the days of us going through vinyl at record stores or even going to the iTunes store and using our parents' login to buy some like explicit Eminem music or something like that. On the day-to-day basis, we interact with a screen like this, most of us anyway, at least 209 million of us around the world. And this is what the music market looks like in terms of access to our daily songs, our daily playlists. Walking between classes, we might go to our music library, or we might go to the top 50 in the US and see some Billy Ray Cyrus song and be like, what's that? Click it, play it, hear how it sounds.
I got the horses in the back.
It's good. I'll add it to my party playlist. Cool. And so it's interesting to consider, you know, the ways in which we've interacted with music have changed so much. And so for me, this was relatively interesting, but there were some other motivations along with why I wanted to write this thesis as well. The first is that streaming platforms have grown so much in size. They now represent about 40% of annual revenue for the global music market, which is really crazy thinking about how recent of kind of an invention they are. Spotify more specifically has over 200 million daily active users, so it is kind of the behemoth within this space. There are other platforms like SoundCloud that have a larger database, but Spotify has gained the largest cultural relevance. There is some literature, surprisingly, that has been done within this space. A lot of data scientists have tapped into this question to see, you know, what is the formula for making a popular song? But all of them use the Billboard Hot 100 charts. And so the Billboard Hot 100, which I'm sure you've heard before, is this great holistic aggregate measure of song popularity that takes into account things like YouTube streams, Spotify streams, physical and digital music sales, as well as mentions on social media. I mean, they really go all out, which is wonderful. But at the same time, it makes it harder to disaggregate popularity through different mediums as well as by country, and that was something that I was really interested in. It's looking at how do preferences change by region of the world. And then so the second thing is that Spotify specific research does exist, although most of it is localized to the idea of how has Spotify disrupted the music market. It's relatively intuitive. They've lowered sales digitally and physically. Makes sense. So I fill this gap in the literature by looking at the determinants of song popularity on Spotify specifically and comparing them between countries. Because I think that's where the most interesting aspect lies. And so popularity in of itself is a very like nebulous concept, so how do we get at that? There are two ways or two variables by which we can measure popularity. The first is a peak position of a song on the top 200 charts. So if you get some song, does it occupy #1 position? Is it like, really popular, or is it peak at like 58 or something like that? That's one form of popularity. A second is the number of days that it survives on the charts. Is it relevant only like for a week or so, or does it stay on for an entire year? Those are both kind of different gauges that we can use to get at this concept. So I look at 5 countries around the world. I go with the US, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Norway, and Taiwan. Get that worldwide perspective, if you will. I'm gonna cut off Pitbull as well. It's gonna get too loud. But anyways, I chose these countries, which are admittedly a little bit random, for 2 reasons. The first was unfortunately data availability. So I wanted to look at the year of 2017 because it's recent and music trends are changing all the time. And this was the most recent data I could get. But unfortunately for a lot of the other countries out there were days missing or even months missing of data. So I was stuck with these ones. And I also wanted a geographic spread as well. And here I have most of the major regions represented. Spotify has yet to expand into Africa, so that wasn't an option. And unfortunately, data for Australia and New Zealand was limited. So I was left with these 5. So moving forward, for the methodology for this study, as I said before, I chose songs from the top 200 charts for all of 2017. So the way it looks in the kind of data set is that you'll have a tab for the US, and then it'll say January 1st, 2017, and there will be 200 rows of data for the top 200 songs of that given day, and then it will change day by day. Unfortunately, data isn't available on all the songs, so across this data set, there's actually only 370 unique songs, but it changes day by day for country. There are different combinations, so it's completely unique by day, by country. And then in terms of the independent variables run for this regression, There's some really unique ones. So they fall into two categories. The first are these variables that I manually entered in myself. It took about 15 to 20 hours, which was things like the genre of a song, the gender of the lead singer, what language the song is sung in, if it was released on a major music label or not, and that's Universal, Warner, EMI, or Sony, which control roughly about 90% of the music market. And then there are these audio features that Spotify actually has themselves, which are really fascinating. So they acquired this company called Econest back in 2014, which essentially developed an algorithm to rate songs based on these different categories like acousticness or danceability. Very clever names, of course. And then valence is kind of an unintuitive one. Valence is a measure of perceived happiness of a song. So if a song sounds really cheerful and bubbly and upbeat, it will score higher, versus if it's not so cheery, it'll score lower. But that's kind of what the data is like. To give you an example, this is the song Rockstar by Post Malone, which is one of those popular songs in 2017. High danceability. I'm gonna cut myself off, too loud. It has relatively high energy, which means it's a little bit more loud, as you can hear. Slightly abrasive and more aggressive. Genre hip hop. Tempo is 144 BPM, so it's a little bit more upbeat. It features a guest, 21 Savage, released on Universal. So this is what it looks like for all of those 370 songs. Now to move on to the actual results and what the findings were. So there were a few, and I'll break it down into peak position and survival. So for peak position, the presence of a featured guest was huge and significant at almost the 1% level for every single country studied, except for the United States, which is kind of interesting. So a few hypotheses as to why this could be that it was significant for the other countries. The first is that when you have a track with a featured guest, you're presumably pulling the featured guest's fan base onto your track. So for Rockstar, Post Malone's pulling 21 Savage's fan base to his song. So that might be part of the reason. The second is that there's like kind of this intrinsic value or stamp of approval on a song that has a featured guest because it got two high-profile artists to collaborate together. There's some literature on that done by a few sociologists in the space. But at the end of the day, these are just kind of generalized hypotheses. It's interesting that the US was not significant for this variable. I don't exactly know why it is. My just intuition is that the US has a history of more famous standalone artists as opposed to elsewhere. But at the end of the day, that's something that could be delved into in of itself. The second thing is that songs that are perceived as happier do better in Norway and Taiwan in terms of peak position as well as survival days on the chart as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't look at that valence term in other countries because there were issues of multicollinearity. But it's kind of interesting because this plays into that narrative that you often hear of like songs on the radio are only really upbeat and cheery and happy. And it seems to maybe be that case in Norway and Taiwan. The jury's out on other places. The last few things for peak position are that songs with higher danceability do better in the US. This is potentially with the increased trend in electronic dance music that's kind of sweeping the younger generations of music listeners. And then the last thing that was really surprising to me was that association with a major music label was not significant in the regression results. I say that this is surprising because for all other literature in the space, it was significant. And I think this is a little bit of sampling bias since I'm just looking at the top 200 songs by country. So I think that necessitates a larger, more diverse sampling in the future. Survival had, again, a lot of same characteristics. A featured guest increases number of days of survival. Happier songs increase the number of days of survival. Another interesting one was that songs that are perceived as louder and more aggressive tend to do a lot worse. My intuition for this is that if you're going to listen to a song for a long period of time or really often, those songs that really catch your ear and you want to go back to, it's hard to make that case for them when they're really intense. Like songs that are R&B actually do really well across all 5 countries because they're a little bit more slow tempo, easier to get into, fit more settings better. So interesting to consider this juxtaposition. So avenues for future research. There are a few. One I mentioned before is that this research should just be repeated with a larger, more diverse sample size to kind of see if these things hold up or if they don't. Second is it would be really fascinating to consider how consumer preferences differ on Spotify as opposed to other music platforms as well. The one that I use the most actually is surprisingly not Spotify. I use SoundCloud a lot, and SoundCloud has the reputation of carrying a lot of rap heavy and a lot electronic heavy music. And so how do preferences differ by platform and how do those platforms push preferences in a certain way would be fascinating. And the thing that I would be most interested in, although I don't know how you would methodologically approach this, is how does the layout of these different platforms affect the preferences of their consumers? So something that's really interesting to me is that Spotify has all these wonderful and great curated playlists that they make, such as Rap Caviar, which has almost 12 million followers. And songs that go on Rap Caviar blow up. They get huge because there are so many people that listen to them. And so it'd be interesting to delve into a little bit about how layout affects preferences over time. Like, as you use Spotify more and more, do you tend towards those curated playlists, or do you hold on your own music tastes? But yeah, I had a lot of fun with this thesis. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something. But yeah, thank you. Oh, and if there are any questions, I can take.
Okay. Oh,
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. So does your analysis offer anything predictive about the future of music and music making? Can you imagine computers and artificial intelligence, the data being used to actually create music? And second, did this research get you a job in the music industry post-graduation?
Both great questions. I'll answer the second first. I will unfortunately not be working in the music industry, although one day I would love to work at a Spotify or something like that in some capacity. Would be a dream, so fun. In terms of your first question, I think that's a really great point and something that I really wanted to tackle with my thesis. I mean, that's the problem with analyzing the music industry is everything is constantly changing and trends and tastes change so quickly. I mean, this is 2017 and it's 2019 and things could already be so much different. So it's really hard to stay on top of it. What I did at the last section of my thesis was to take, because my data goes all the way up to the first week of 2018, and so I chose the #1 song for the first week of 2018, which was, I believe, the Finesse remix with Cardi B and Bruno Mars. Anyways, I looked at the features of that song and the data for that song and predicted, okay, if I want a song that is happier, that has low energy, that has a featured guest on the track, how would it compare in terms of statistics for previous songs that were big right before it? And it was kind of similar on a few of them, but it's honestly just a scattershot. The other problem that I ran into with this thesis, which me and my reader talked about relatively extensively, is that there's a lot of outliers in terms of like the data that I'm working with, because songs like Post Malone's song has really high energy, which is something that negatively affects all other songs in the sample. But this song stayed #1 for almost like 300 days. So it's really hard to build predictive power when they're just anomalies all the time, because some songs just set trends and it's hard to predict for that. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting question to ask though. Thank you for the question. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Like Brendan, I'll also be talking about music. I'm just going back a bit into the past here. So as a music and government dual major, I've always been interested in the intersection of music and politics, just like Brendan is interested in the music and economics research. So under the guidance of Professor Pitney at the CMC Government Department and Professor Kong at the Scripps Music Department, I've been able to spend the last year researching Civil War songs, specifically the Battle Cry of Freedom, a Union anthem, the Bonnie Blue Flag, and Dixie, which are Confederate anthems. When I started researching these songs, I found these small mentions of Union lyrics to Confederate anthems and Confederate lyrics to Union anthems, and I started to analyze these alternate lyrics and found that both sides use the terms liberty and freedom with relative frequency. So my thesis explores the northern and southern understanding of the terms liberty and freedom, specifically through these alternate lyrics written to Union and Confederate anthems. And basically my thesis comes to the conclusion that the North and South both sang about these terms with relative frequency because they had completely different understandings of what liberty and freedom actually meant, right? When the South sang for freedom, they were talking about the freedom to be free from northern subjugation, right? The freedom from northern tyranny, and the liberty to choose the Southern way of life. And really what that meant at the end of the day was the institution of slavery. I was especially drawn in my research to this culture of fluidity within music in the Civil War, a culture where borrowing melodies and stealing chord progressions and rewriting and recontextualizing happened every single day. The stories behind who composed these songs are pretty wild, as are the stories of who rewrote these songs and which lyrics they preferred. So today I want to focus on the story of one song in particular. On April 10th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln stood on the White House balcony. News of General Lee's surrender to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse the day before had just reached Washington, D.C., and civilians flooded the streets to celebrate the president. The president's address would prove to be his last. 4 days later, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Lincoln only said a few words. He commended the energy of the crowd, talked about how auspicious it was that everyone was there together. Seeing a band present, he closed the ceremonies by requesting them to play a specific tune, a song he called one of the best tunes I have ever heard. The tune he suggested was shocking. It was the Confederate marching song, Dixie. Why did Lincoln ask the band to play the de facto national anthem of the Confederacy? Some historians have argued that by requesting the song, the president called for symbolic forgiveness of the Confederate States, a reintegration of their culture and their people into the Union, in the same way that he called for malice toward none in his second inaugural address. But these historians must not have read the rest of Lincoln's speech, because he continued, "Our adversaries over the way attempted to appropriate the song, but I insisted yesterday that we fairly captured it. I presented the question to the Attorney General, and he gave it as his legal opinion that it is our lawful prize." Lincoln's lighthearted comment reveals an important attitude, right? He wasn't asking for symbolic forgiveness or reintegration of the Confederate States into the Union, but talking about his very own lawful prize, right? The melodic spoils of war. Lincoln recognized the power of music during the Civil War, and that's why it's so surprising that Dixie, one of the most potent of all Confederate songs, was composed by a Northerner. Dan Emmett, the composer of Dixie, was a Northerner and Union man. He had previously performed in the circus and found success composing for minstrel groups in the North. For those who are not familiar with minstrelsy, it's a pretty awful tradition where white people will dress up in blackface and entertain other, usually white people, for it was not good. It was not good. Basically, minstrelsy was highly popular in the North, and Dan Emmett worked for one of the most famous minstrel groups, Bryant's Minstrels. In 1859, 2 years before the war began, he had only 2 days to write a song for the grand finale of the troupe's new act. He had some serious musical writer's block and claimed that one line kept repeating itself in his mind: "I wish I was in Dixie," referring to Southern states. Dixie premiered and swept New York. It left the minstrel tradition and just became a very popular song of the day. President James Buchanan played it at his final party at the White House, and Lincoln used it during his 1860 presidential campaign. At some point, the song travels south, most likely through a popular burlesque show, Pocahontas. Americans loved it. It didn't matter for a time if you were a Northerner or a Southerner. Everyone loved Emmett's song. Slowly but surely, the Confederacy starts to appropriate the song. A lot of music historians like to point to the performance at Jefferson Davis's inauguration to the Confederate States, right, February 18th, 1861. That may have been the moment that the Confederacy really adopted it as a de facto anthem. But by 1863, the tune was so distinctly Confederate that Union troops forbade singing it and assaulted and beat up anyone who did. Emmett wasn't trained as an anthem composer. He never meant to write an anthem, let alone a Confederate anthem. I think a lot of students here might relate to this. He just had a deadline. Emmett's story can tell us a couple of things, right? Deadlines can spur us to some massive successes, and it can also tell us a lot about unintended consequences. Emmett's song, the use, the purpose, and even the meaning of that song completely escaped him, right? He had no control over how the South used it. Emmett's story is emblematic of a greater tradition. We're all familiar with how movements can co-opt other ideas. One example is how the Christian community has rewritten Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, changing the first line from "I'd heard there was a secret chord" to "a crown of thorns placed on his head," right? Another more sinister example is how Nazis twisted the symbol of the swastika, taking an ancient image that was used in Buddhist and Mesopotamian cultures as a symbol of peace and balance. Movements almost by nature co-opt and envelop ideas that their creators never meant to be enveloped, right? When he learned the Confederacy had taken his song and so decisively adopted it, Emmett said, "If I had known to what use they are going to put my song, I will be damned if I had written it." Despite his best intentions, Dan Emmett will go down in the books as the unwitting composer of this Confederate tune. This is what his gravestone reads. Rough. "We are a part of a society that is deeply familiar with the problem of mixed legacy and unintended legacy," right? Maryland knows this problem well. Their state song, "Maryland, My Maryland," was written during the Civil War by a Confederate sympathizer. It refers to Abraham Lincoln as a despot and Northerners as scum. And at the moment, Democratic state senators have a bill on both the House floor and Senate floor to repeal and replace this is their official state song, right? They've gotten so far as having it redesignated as the historical state song rather than the official state song, which is a step in the right direction. Dixie still has this incredibly mixed legacy, right? Many students at schools in the South have protested the playing of Dixie by their marching bands. where it's an instrumental staple. Protests have erupted at the University of Virginia, Georgia Tech, Tulane University, and in 1968, right after the Civil Rights Movement, the president of the University of Miami actually banned the song from performances by the marching band. Language and music, especially in combination, made such a huge impact on the Civil War. We're still dealing with the effects and ramifications of songs written during this time. These songs engendered so many feelings, but very, very different feelings even from the same piece of music. So why is this important? My thesis basically concludes saying that there is this immense power in language and in music to shape our ideas, but there's a problem of understanding, right? We can talk politically, be using the exact same words and phrases and songs to mean completely different things. We have to confront the problem of specificity in language and in music. What exactly do we mean when we sing about liberty and freedom? What does that actually look like when executed at a practical level? And today I think it's relevant because we talk about terms like fascism or appropriation all the time without necessarily getting into the specifics of what that looks like, right? So politically, there's great value in taking a moment to define precisely what we mean in our minds, and a beauty in explaining what our ideas look like in practical application to our political foes. Thank you. I'm happy to take a couple questions.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks, Lauren.
I was wondering what you found to be your greatest challenge in this entire process in trying to work through the primary sources and in the contested legacies of these songs today.
Absolutely. So I didn't talk too much about this, but really I looked at the alternate lyrics, right? So the Union versions of Dixie and other Confederate songs, and the Confederate versions of like Battle Cry Freedom and Union songs. So I was very lucky in that a lot of the sheet music of the time has been digitized by great institutions. Mostly I looked at Duke's collection. But part of my, I think, challenge was that not many people have touched these contrafacta, these alternate songs. And so I felt, I think that this is a problem that a lot of undergrad students face when they're looking at material that has not been talked about or researched by the experts. And I felt definitely like a little bit of imposter syndrome, perhaps, like, do I have the right to be analyzing these songs? Like, no one's ever done this, I don't know. I think as a government major, oftentimes, we take two very well-respected sources or three very well-respected sources who all have a different opinion on something and say, this is what, so-and-so thinks, and this is what so-and-so thinks. But really, at the end of the day, it lies somewhere in the middle, and this is my opinion, right? That's what we do oftentimes in Gov. And so it was a struggle for me to be able to just I suppose, get into the very nitty-gritty of things that no one had ever looked at before. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Will Cullen, for those who don't know me. Hi, everyone. I'm Will Cullen, for those who don't know me. I'm majoring in environment, economics, and politics, and doing a sequence in human rights studies. First, I'd just love to thank Priya for inviting me to this event. Second, I'd love to thank Professor Sinha for ceaseless support, guidance, and mentorship through the senior thesis writing process. I'm so thankful for her encouragement for me to return to India over winter break to conduct interviews. Third, I'd love to thank my aunt and uncle for driving here all the way from Santa Monica during rush hour traffic. Thank you so much for coming to this event. Fourth, I'd love to thank all my other professors here, in particular Professor Asher, Professor Lauer, Professor Rentz, to name a few, and all my friends here who have provided so much support these past 4 years at CMC. So to start off, my thesis was on subnational motivations for renewable energy development in India. And so this project really began over a year and a half ago with my decision to study abroad in India. I studied abroad in Jaipur, doing a homestay, as well as, so I'm just gonna set a timer. There we go. So I studied abroad in Jaipur, doing a homestay, learned how to read and write Hindi, as well as took classes on sustainable development. I did a research project on rural electrification to understand how to distribute electricity to the roughly 300 million people who currently lack access to electricity in India. And so during my time there, I was really struck by the level of economic growth that was happening amidst massive inequality and environmental degradation. Most people don't know this, but Delhi's air pollution is actually 20 times worse than that in Beijing. And when I was living there for a month, I had to wear a face mask every day just to get through the day. And when we visited the Taj Mahal and my family came out at the end of the program, you could see the Taj Mahal when it wasn't foggy out during the day and that when it was. It has massive implications for security concerns domestically. It has massive security concerns, and as well as India's projection of power on the world stage. So in order to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target established during the Paris Climate Accord, much of the action is dependent on India and China to transition to renewable energy. Providing energy security and diversifying the energy production in India align with the country's rising power ambitions and policy goals to industrialize. Renewable energy provides a powerful tool for the state to meet these policy goals without producing more air pollution and additional environmental degradation. So India has 29 different states with very distinctive cultural, linguistic, and developmental outcomes. Uttar Pradesh, for example, in the north, has roughly 200 million people and would be actually the 6th largest population were it its own country. Kerala, in the south, has very progressive welfare policies and has human development indicators similar to those in Northern Europe. Electricity is on the concurrent list in India, and so the policymaking process is shared by both the central government and the state governments. In my thesis, I applied Professor Sinha's theory on polycentric hierarchy, in which state-level bureaucrats take advantage of central government fiscal incentives and compete to attract investment in their respective states. Therefore, as a departure from traditional political science theory, it is much more useful to analyze the state-level variations in policies than it is the central government alone. This led me to 3 major research questions. 1, why is there variation in the installed capacity of renewable energy in different states? 2, what are the motivations of subnational bureaucrats in devising renewable energy policies? And 3, what is the role of the central government in creating new resources, incentives, and policy ideas for the states to develop renewable energy? I went through roughly 25 central government reports and scraped data from all of them on the respective breakdown of renewable energy for all 29 states in India, which took a lot of time. But I made these really nice graphs for my thesis. And so as you can see, there are several states that really lead the charge in renewable energy development. However, there are others who are not doing so well in renewable energy development. So you look at a state like Tamil Nadu, which has actually more wind energy capacity than any other nation state in Europe other than Germany. So it has more renewable energy capacity than Denmark, more than Sweden, but we don't usually hear about that on the world stage when we talk about India and hear about their air pollution. And so this really led me to a lot of really interesting things that I analyzed for the different states. As we see here, several states lead the charge, and development doesn't solely depend on the renewable energy potential of the states. If you look at the utilization of these 4 different states, which I use in my thesis, Gujarat, Kerala, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, and then looking at that compared to the average for India, they differ greatly. And so this led me to develop an analytical framework based off of the central government's additional fiscal incentives that they provided to the states to understand the motivations, interests, and incentives of subnational elites in devising policies to promote renewable energy development in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Gujarat, and Rajasthan. I developed an analytical framework based on these 4 variables that I determined based off of the literature. 1, state-level party politics. 2, financial space or indebtedness of state distribution companies, which actually distribute the electricity from either private producers or government-owned entities to the people in these rural villages and cities. 3, institutional knowledge of the state nodal renewable energy agencies, which actually coordinate with the central government's Ministry of New and Renewable Energy on the central level. And then also state linkages with the private sector to examine the different modes of vertical alignment in the subnational actors to employ renewable energy policies. And so first off, this is a nice graph of Tamil Nadu's renewable energy capacity. The blue is actually wind capacity. And you can see that in the 1980s, Tamil Nadu coordinated with private investors in the private sector to produce a reliable energy for an energy crisis that happened in the 1980s. And so through proper institutional knowledge and state nodal agencies, as well as private sector linkages, they were able to develop very quickly with renewable energy. And Kerala, which was the most interesting case study, has actually the first ever popularly elected communist government, which is in the south of India, and it has very high human development indicators as a result. However, it does not have much renewable energy capacity. It has a lot of small hydropower, but it has very little wind power, as you can see on the bottom, even though it has a lot of potential. This made me realize that despite high development indicators, the government, the State Electricity Board refused to privatize and unbundle during the electricity reforms in the 1990s, which negatively impacted the reform process for expanding ways of renewable energy generation. In their effort to popularize renewable energy, as you can see from these government reports that I was able to look at over winter break when I returned for field visits, it really emphasizes the public good and the welfare involved in renewable energy development, and it's much more decentralized than the other states. Looking at Gujarat, which was really interesting because the current prime minister was a chief minister of the state previously. He initiated the first solar policy in all of India in 2009. So you can see solar power growth in the beginning, but it actually does not increase much going forward. A lot of that was from industry linkages beforehand, as well as effective government bureaucracy in implementing these policies. Rajasthan, where I studied abroad, had a very quick, rapid increase in renewable energy. And that was mostly central government dictated, so the central government started policies and encouraged state elites to implement them. And they made major strides in making it cost competitive using large solar parks. So real quick, I just wanted to, for those of you who are interested in doing field research for maybe your thesis next year or going forward, there are a lot of challenges, but it was a very exciting experience overall. I'd say if you can do anything, if you do happen to do field research in India, always take the train. You always get great conversations while you're on the train. This is a picture on the bottom right of a state-level electricity board that I went to, and it was really just stacks of papers. It was really fascinating to see the whole policy implementation process take place, especially on these subnational forums in which not many experts have the ability to go to and understand fully. I thought another challenge was the linguistic barriers. At the top right was an example of a certificate that I got when I went to go and meet a state-level bureaucrat that I was emailing with, who I had contact with beforehand. There happened to be a labor strike as I arrived in Bangalore, and the government agency was completely closed, even though there were bureaucrats inside. So I had to wait outside the gate for 3 hours for them to open it. Once they finally opened the door, they gave me this certificate to meet Mr. Raju was his name. But there were actually 3 people named Mr. Raju in the energy department in Bangalore. So that was really exciting, really interesting. Had to really work on my feet to kind of figure out exactly who I was meeting with. But after about an hour and a half of circling around this building, I finally found him, and it was actually one of my best resources for my thesis. Another interesting account was in Tamil Nadu. They have a festival called Pongal, which happens right in January. So right when I arrived in Tamil Nadu. Even though I had set up several interviews, when I got to the wind developer's office, they just had this painted on the floor, Happy Pongal, and there's no one who was actually in the office. which was kind of fun. I actually had to go back. Luckily, I was there for about a week and a half, so I was able to then go back a couple days later. But it was a 5-day long holiday. And so it was interesting, and it was a really interesting holiday to like understand and learn about. And there was like different cultural lessons that you learn by actually going there and understanding about. And it really made me understand the differences in the different states. And so it was actually very useful for my research overall. Just final takeaways. As I was flying into Bangalore, I saw this outside of the window from my seat in the plane, and they're actually wind turbines. And so one interesting takeaway was one that a lot of this renewable energy development was the result of state nodal agencies' linkages with the private sector rather than environmental groups, which was really interesting, to ensure energy security to private developers and commercial enterprises and industries. However, it's also interesting because in almost every interview that I did, the bureaucrats really emphasized how large the solar parks were and how large the windmills were. And so this is an example of also just large infrastructure projects playing an interesting role in political, just like political dynamics in general and distribution of public goods. One most interesting quote was, one person in Bangalore said, a large solar park was our Great Wall of China. And so it was just interesting to understand the rising power status of both India in contrast to China, and China's ability to really pioneer renewable energy policies really before India had really caught on. And so it'll be interesting to see going forward how the two rising powers compete in this industry going forward. Thank you. Time for questions? Any questions?
As a historian and archivist, I was most drawn to the photo where you had stacks of papers.
Oh, yeah.
So what did you do when you faced that stack?
Oh, so actually that stack wasn't for me, luckily. It was when I was in one of the, I think it was in Tamil Nadu, their state electricity board. That was all the paperwork that the different bureaucrats were going through for their daily, tasks. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Maddie Lee and I am an international relations major here at CMC. I would just like to thank first and foremost my thesis advisor, Professor Jenny Ta, for embarking on this journey with me in this topic. I hate to break it to you, you're gonna listen to a whole other presentation about developing countries, renewable energy, so please bear with me. But this time you're gonna hear about Mongolia, so hopefully that's exciting for anyone. I don't know. But basically I wrote my thesis on a lot of different things about kind of social aspects of renewable energy, technological aspects, and how those exactly intertwine, how they connect. A little bit of background on what exactly drew this to me. Very similar story to Will. I studied abroad in Mongolia 2 years ago and was fascinated not only by the renewable energy development there, but what exactly was being done to increase renewable energy development. Mongolia has a ton of renewable energy potential, but there aren't a lot of large-scale facilities, at least they weren't when I studied abroad, and I wanted to know why exactly that was. And this led me to ask a lot of questions personally and kind of academically of what exactly was involved in renewable energy. And I made this mind map at the beginning of the year, kind of in September, and describing what exactly was going on in my head. So things like normative frameworks, things like climate change, things like history, things like actual technology, kind of all of these things that I was thinking about, and I wanted to figure out if there was a way that I could put these all together in some format or some system. And luckily, a lot of really intelligent people have studied this issue before, and I found out that there is actually this concept called socio-technical systems, which are basically systems that are not purely just technological, but also function as a result of being placed in society. So you can think of these things like energy systems, but also agriculture, healthcare systems, kind of anything that isn't purely just technological, but the reason that it functions is because it is part of society. And energy being one of these, I wanted to figure out how Mongolia could actually increase this development, drawing on the fact that energy is not just technology. It has to interact with people every day, it has to be used by people, everyone relies on it, and so it's purely a very societal thing in its nature, and how exactly that plays into it was really interesting to me. And so I stumbled across this heuristic framework, basically that a lot of people have used to explain these kind of transitions in history, called the multi-level perspective, the MLP, as it's referred to. And it describes 3 layers. So basically kind of in international relations theory, there's a lot of talk about like the domestic layer and then the international context and then kind of very on the ground things. This is a little bit different in that the landscape level is kind of a background, exogenous context for what exactly is going on. So things like the sustainability attitudes of the international community, or the fact that now developed countries are taking on increasing responsibility to help developing countries, or things like attitudes even towards renewable energy, because things like the nuclear disasters happened in Fukushima and Chernobyl. Things like that are at the landscape level. At the regime level is the entrenched system, so why exactly coal systems are still in place, why people are reliant on them, attitudes and kind of things that contribute to the fact that these systems are so entrenched. And at the niche level is kind of the startup culture. It's where development happens, it's where innovations happen, and they're kind of considered to be at the niche level because this is where they're allowed to grow outside of the regime, where they wouldn't necessarily survive if they were just kind of thrust in there. And so my research question was, can this actually apply to Mongolia's transition at all? And ultimately, I found out that yes, it really does. This framework not only allows for explanation of developed countries' transitions, but also developing countries, and that it really shows how all of these levels interact in a way that a lot of other frameworks that only look at technological things or only look at societal things really fail to account for. But that being said, there are definitely still a lot of limitations within this theory. And one of the things that I found was in Mongolia particularly, there are a ton of actors that are not necessarily domestic, but also not completely international. They interact with all of these different players and make a lot of different things really challenging, but also help a lot of things. So then I also started reading a bit more and found out that there are these concepts called transnational linkages and intermediaries, and Will was kind of talking about this a little bit, but partnerships between the private and the public sectors and kind of figuring out how these actors actually blend together and give Mongolia financing opportunities to really allow it to grow this renewable energy in a way that a lot of countries wouldn't be able to if they didn't have this help, because many developing countries do lack a lot of institutional capacity and really knowledge that you need to have to get these renewable energy systems off the ground. This research has primarily been focused in 4 countries. The first, actually, most primarily is India, so Will's totally on the hammer, hit the hammer on the nail on this one. But the second is China, the third one is South Africa, and the fourth is Tanzania. No one's actually looked at this in Mongolia before. Mongolia doesn't get a lot of attention. There's where it is. I didn't know where it was before I studied abroad. I assume a lot of people don't know, but it's actually sandwiched between Russia and China, so you can tell why it doesn't get a lot of attention, because it's a very small country compared to 2 very massive authoritarian powers. But it is a democracy, so it has that going for it. But yeah, I guess one of the things that I found really interesting about Mongolia is that it loves the international community so much that it really just, any opportunity to be in the international community, it cherishes. And this has really allowed its renewable energy to grow. So at the landscape level, this looks a lot of different ways, but especially partnering with the United Nations, being involved in all of these treaties. Mongolia, fun fact, is one of the only countries in the world that has diplomatic relations with both North and South Korea. So we could have held the summit there. It was supposedly debated, but it really focuses on being an international member. And it's interesting because a lot of Mongolians themselves aren't able to travel outside of Mongolia or have that international exposure, but they still really uphold the international community in a way that really has allowed them to be completely receptive of international help in a way that a lot of developing countries aren't able to take advantage of it necessarily. This is just a little picture of one of the main squares, or is the main square in Mongolia, in the capital Ulaanbaatar at night. It's called Sukbatar Square. And this, I kind of put up here just to talk about the regime level in Mongolia. Coal is super entrenched in the country, and it definitely is something that people really rely on. Mongolia actually has the worst air pollution in the capital city Ulaanbaatar, because it gets so cold. It gets to be negative 40 degrees in the winter, which is either Celsius or Fahrenheit. It's the same. And so it's really cold. Yeah. But yeah, so one of the things about Mongolia is that it has all of these challenges that it has to face. So things like the institutional capacity of coal, the fact that these systems were built when Mongolia was a Soviet country, and so they're really old, and they weren't actually put in place by Mongolians, they were put in place by the Russians. So there's all these things to navigate, even though Mongolia has decided on a very progressive and democratic kind of government agenda level that they really want to prioritize renewable energy. And this means that a lot of things have been happening in Mongolia because they are able to take advantage not only of the international community, but their own proclivity towards participating in this community and looking towards sustainable development. Mongolia has such high aspirations in terms of being a member of this community and really pushing towards the goals that are illuminated in the Paris Agreement and the climate change accords and all of these other international landmark agreements that people kind of see as these visions on a hill, but Mongolia really believes that it can get there, which is something that's been really awesome to kind of research and see the dynamics of. There's this very ideological component of renewable energy development that I think is definitely allowed Mongolia to expand a lot more than you might see in another developing country. These are just a couple more pictures. This is the first large-scale solar farm in Mongolia. It's in Dakhan, which is about an hour north or so of Ulaanbaatar. But I got to visit this when I was studying abroad, and I interviewed a couple people. And it was just cool to see kind of the manifestation of all of this work and all of this research kind of on the ground. Similarly, this is the first large-scale solar farm in Mongolia, in Solkhet, and that was also, wind turbine. And that was just cool as well, because you really get to see all of these projects actually coming to fruition in a way that not being there and other things you wouldn't necessarily know about. So to conclude, I think Mongolia is a great example because it really allows you to kind of see not only how developing countries are looking towards renewable energy development, but the potential that exists out there when you draw on these transnational linkages and intermediaries in a way that a lot of developing countries maybe not have been able to, but would be able to draw on in the future. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Okay, perfect.
So, are you going back?
I am going back. Yeah, I'm actually doing Fulbright there. So, yeah. Yeah, but I will be going back to research this topic for 10 more months. I'm super excited, but yeah. I hope I survive the cold. That's my main worry. Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. So in the program, I think the first word is blood, which is a little unusual for an ATH program, but I guess I'll be the person speaking on that this evening. So my name is Connor Bloom, and like everyone else here, I'm a senior, also making that mistake here. But I am a science management major with a focus in biotech. And so my major really kind of splits down into spending a lot of time doing genetics, then spending a lot of time kind of doing corporate finance. And in looking for a thesis topic, I want something that did both. And over the summer, our career services office actually emailed me and said, we have a really interesting question. Some of our alums who work at the San Diego Blood Bank and actually direct the San Diego Blood Bank want to answer the question, does it make sense to genetically test blood donors? They pitched it as a 6-week project. Now, 9 months later, we have like a start to an answer of that entire thing. So this is a really long, complex title, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to, should you genetically test blood donors? And I looked at that from a healthcare point of view, aka could we have better patient outcomes? But at the end of the day, I also looked at that from an economics point of view, because we can say all that we want about patient outcomes and making lives better, but in healthcare in America, if there's not a financial reason to do it, it's not going to happen. So let's do a brief overview of genetics and how we got here in the first place. Back in 2001, in the 1990s, it cost $1 billion to sequence the first human genome. That price has dropped precipitously. It's kind of unreal, quite frankly. This past fall, actually, Veritas Genomics in Cambridge announced a $200 price for a full genomic test. That's unprecedented. It sold out within 4 hours. On February 29th, actually, just of 2019, the CEO of Illumina, the world's largest biotech firm, or one of them, that produces all the equipment needed to do genetic testing, announced that they were targeting a goal of $100 by the end of this year and $10 by the end of 2020. To go from $1 billion to $10 in 2 decades is quite frankly unprecedented. So let's go through a brief primer on how blood works, right? We all have it, we all share it here in this room. And we're probably pretty familiar with the basics in that we all have little red blood cells, and we're all familiar with our ABO type. So we know we have A, B, AB, O, and that's O negative or A positive or whatever that may be. And in essence, what that means is that on all of our little red blood cells, we have these little kind of what we call antigens sticking up from them. Proteins, carbohydrates, other little flags that stick up and basically tell the rest of your immune system, hi, I'm a friend. Like, don't attack me, I'm friendly, I'm part of you in essence. So this is the middle school version. This is the real version. Instead of having just ABO, positive or negative, we have 36 blood groups. And we have 346 different antigens. That's millions of permutations, because you can have up to 346, or you can have 2, or you can have 45, or you can have 72. You can have any combination of these. And now, why are these important? Because when we do blood transfusions, we want to make sure we don't kill you at the end of the day, right? In essence, if you are someone who has type A blood, for example, your immune system will recognize type A totally fine and be okay with it. But if we give you a transfusion from someone with type B blood, your immune system will look at the little antigens, the little flags that are on those foreign red blood cells, and worry that you are being attacked, in essence, and so it will go out and try to destroy all of those foreign red blood cells. And that can be a problem because the immune system isn't as specific as we necessarily want to. And so we occasionally get massive collateral damage and then you die. And that's not necessarily fun. And so we try to avoid that as much as we can. With that being said, currently the standard in hospitals across the world is just to blood test for ABO and RH, those very first two. And that's quite frankly because testing for the rest of these is too expensive. And we would rather run the risk as a hospital that you have a reaction and then we treat it and hopefully keep you alive, then try to test for all of these. Because statistically, it's always been thought that would be cheaper. Turns out that's not quite the case. But in terms of actual testing, pulled this from stock photos on Google Images, although this is remarkably similar to what a blood bank actually looks like in their wet labs. In terms of actual testing, I said it was a little expensive before. It's $57 on average per antigen. So per little red flag, or per whatever color flag you may have, it's $57 to test for each of those, and we have up to 346 of those. So you can see how that gets expensive very, very, very quickly, especially when the average cost to treat a reaction, like a mismatch, is only $2,000. And so there's really no incentive to test beyond 4 or 5 of these, especially since as a blood bank, you can only sell blood for about $200 due to market conditions. And so why test beyond ABO, quite frankly? Well, it turns out that we partnered up, I say we, meaning the San Diego Blood Bank, partnered up with a startup in San Diego that can knock that down to $32 per sample. Not $32 per antigen per individual flag, but $32 to test for all 346 in one fell swoop. And we can do it in 4 hours. And that's way quicker than this guy doing this over 5 or 10 days, quite frankly. So not only can we do that, but we can also do 384 individuals simultaneously and have it output in 4 hours maximum. And then we can turn around and say, this is your full genotype, for all 346 possible antigens that you may or may not have, which is pretty incredible. We're currently in clinical trials actually in San Diego, and my thesis is being redacted as I can't publish until next fall when San Diego also publishes their data. But so far we are 100%, over 100%, all the data is matching up perfectly, which is pretty astounding. So that takes care of kind of the blood banking side in that it's clearly cheaper to do this genetically. But what about the hospital side? Was there an argument to be made there? And so we built a model to estimate it. We looked at the probability of mismatches. So within those 346 different antigens, they vary by population. People from West Africa, for example, often score or often have much lower percentage of some groups versus people who have European ancestry. So even within races and ethnicities, it gets really complex. But we basically aggregated as much genetic data as existed, and a study just came out from Harvard in November 28th of 2018, that pulled about 150,000 individuals. But we aggregated all that genetic data and said, okay, if we pick 2 random people, was the probability that one of these 346 or all of them will have some mismatch? We then said, was the probability that they will actually have a reaction to this? Because not everyone has reactions. Only 13% of any given population will actually develop a reaction, but it's impossible to predict. We have no idea. Geneticists have no idea. Statisticians have no idea. Molecular immunohematologists have no idea. We just aren't quite there yet. But we aggregate the probability of mismatch, the probability that then you will have a reaction, and then how much that will average cost to treat. And we basically put that into a giant model that is usually used to calculate IPO stock prices, but I adapted it for genetics. Because this is CMC and interdisciplinary things, I suppose. This is the new science center in a nutshell. But anyways, we plugged all this in and said, in a base case or a random case where you were only matching ABO and pretty much nothing else, For 1 million patients, on average, it'll cost you $71 million to treat the associated reactions that will probabilistically occur as a result of only matching ABO. We then took it one step further and said, okay, we have reliable data for 65 out of those 346, 64 antigens. What happens if we make a graph that looks at matching each of those in stepwise fashion? So matching the one that's most likely to cause reaction, then 1 and 2, then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. The yellow line shows how much we currently spend trying to treat the reactions that happen. The red line is the probability. I wish I could step away from this for a second, but the red line is how many antigens we're matching, aka how close of a match we're getting, as compared to the right, aka the probability that there will be any mismatch whatsoever. Then blue and orange represent the cost associated with that red line. And so if we match the top 10 or so with the orange line, which is also genetically testing people at the hospital to make sure that this matches up, if we match the top 10, we're already well below the current cost of transfusion reactions, how much they pose to hospitals. Eventually, we reach the blue line, and that's because the blue line represents how much this would cost if we already had a pool of people who need transfusions who are already genetically tested. The orange line is just adding in that extra genetic testing cost. So in perfect scenario, once everyone does get genetically tested to be able to match those, we go down to the blue line, and you can see we quite quickly drop to near zero once you get in 27 matches or so, which is pretty absurd. To the best of my knowledge, this study has never been conducted before. Moreover, in talking with San Diego Blood Bank, we are currently in clinical trials. We also lobbied the FDA this past fall because prior to this fall, you could not do genetic testing for blood. It had to be done in a wet lab, and we said that's kind of ridiculous. Genetic testing has come a long way. They gave us clearance in October. And so we hope, and it's our belief, that this will become the norm, at least matching for the first 10 by next fall within San Diego. And we believe, and hopefully, fingers crossed here, that this extrapolates out to the rest of the United States probably within the next 5 years. And we're hoping that we can get to a point where transfusion reactions are basically a thing of the past because we can match you accurately enough genetically that A, we're driving down healthcare costs for hospitals and for patients across the country. B, we're driving down costs for blood banks across the country. And C, we do get those better patient outcomes that we talked about in the very beginning. So we use an economic analysis, we use a genetic argument to drive down or drive up patient healthcare outcomes. And our hope is that within 5 years, we will reach the status, and that is the current state of it. We hope that that's where we end up. But yeah, that's the summary of all this. 9 months and one graph later, this is where we're at. And I suppose I have a few minutes, and a lot of people think.
Thank you, that was terrific. Quick question for you. Once somebody's tested, are you going to put their information in a bank so they never have to be retested?
Really good question. My thesis did not deal with the ethical, legal, or privacy issues, which is what this definitely gets at. It's a really good question, and I think we've seen some big data breaches rather in the last year. Ancestry.com had a pretty infamous one a couple months ago. That's a really good question. The hope is that we won't have to retest these people again, especially if you are being treated for cancer or you have sickle cell disease. You need blood transfusions every couple weeks, every couple months. And so the hope is we do a one test and we're done with it, because then we can get down to this blue line as we see. But yeah, of course.
Hi. If you test for, let's say, the top 10, as you say, what will that do to sort of the blood supply? Right now, you say, okay, you're A positive. There's a bank of A plus blood. But now what would it do if now you were trying to match those 10?
Right, so we call it kind of the colloquialism we've been using is super O negative blood, aka kind of the top 10 O negative plus plus plus, doing even better. Because the antigens we're most worried about, we only get worried about them if they are around 50% of the population. Because the closer you are to half, the more likelihood that there is going to be a mismatch. And so actually we don't have to worry about the blood supply too much because we know that they already exist in roughly 50% of donors. We just don't currently test for them because it's too expensive. And we'd rather say, you should be fine, it'll be fine, and then deal with it later than treat or test everyone up front. So we should be okay. If we're looking for trying to get negative across the board, it'll get a little bit more difficult, but we're not quite there yet. Of course. Thank you guys so much.
Hi, my name is Lauren Brody. I am unsurprisingly a senior here at the college, and I'm a history major. And what I believed was going to be a thesis about the Swiss Civil Code and Turkish constitutionalism and the way it affected minority populations in the modern nation state of Turkey ended up totally being sidetracked as I began my research in the memoir of this man, Eli Scholl. And he was born in Balat, a mixed denominational quarter of Istanbul, as most quarters of Istanbul are actually mixed across ethno-religious lines because of the rich history of the Ottoman Empire. And he wrote that as a child, as he grew up during the transition from the Ottoman Empire into the Turkish nation state, that his mother and other elders of the Jewish community would always say to him, "Nia fuego, nia pleito," which is Ladino, almost a Sephardi Yiddish, an amalgamation of Spanish, Italian, and Hebrew, saying which meant, do not get into fire and do not get involved in a quarrel, which was almost a both explicit and implicit signal to members of the Jewish community to not be publicly involved in affairs, in resistance against disruption, corruption. And I just, growing up myself in a Jewish family, I just couldn't believe that that was then the party line or the community line overall within Jewish communities. A, because there were nearly 1 million Jews in the Ottoman Empire, and B, in my own family, there are 5 people and 6 opinions. So I just couldn't imagine. That all Jews in this shift from empire to nation state actually believed that following the Ottoman status quo was the only future. So for those who don't have any history of Ottoman Jews, so very quickly, in the pre-19th century, Jews paid a poll tax called the jizya, and there were barriers to entry into the Ottoman civil service, mostly because most Jews did speak either Ladino or Arabic. And so what I really wanted to explore in my thesis was how did Sephardi versus Arab Jews respond to not just the new reforms that enabled them to, through new education opportunities, enter the Ottoman civil service if they desired, but also these new international cultural exchange and knowledge production in regard to this idea of nationalism, and if actually they were interested in that. And unsurprisingly, they were. But what was most interesting was that many of them were not interested in Jewish separatist movements, say as Hungarian separatist movements or others, but rather were interested in being enfolded into broader nationalist movements. So Sephardi Jews are Jews of Iberian origin who Sultan Bayezid II, during the Spanish Inquisition, sent ships to bring them over to Anatolia and Greece, whereas Arab Jews are ethnically Arab, and most speak obviously Arabic, and they as well stayed often in Arab lands, i.e. Therefore they felt local and native to the communities in which they inhabited. So whereas Sephardi Jews often felt as though they were guests of the empire, yet at the same time simultaneously being local and citizens for subjects and then later citizens for centuries, Arab Jews aren't having that same conflict. They're feeling very much a part of the, dynamic overall community in their provinces. So I was interested in who were the types of Jews, or rather communities who were foreseeing new alternatives and paths for themselves. So the first I would say are traditionalists. So these are people really excited about these reforms and want to remain in the status quo. They enjoy their relationship with the Sultan, and they don't want to change the imperial context and move into a nationalist context. So this is a rabbi named Moshe Halevi. He served as the Chacham Bashi, which is a new position created in the Ottoman Empire in response to these new reforms, as an official intermediary between the Jewish community and the Ottoman state. And so here he is actually doing a sermon on encouraging Jews to be supportive of Ottoman frontier armed conflicts that are going on in modern day Crimea. And then in contrast, you have people such as Abraham Galante, who actually see a future in a nation state, but still within the Turkish or Ottoman context. So they don't actually view them, he doesn't at least view himself, or nor does he in his own journal, such as Lavara, that Jews should remain in an Ottoman imperial context, but rather in a national context, and be considered Turkish. And so therefore he encourages his fellow Jews to renounce Ladino as their national language or communal language, and rather embrace Turkish. And then you had Sephardi Zionists, which, unlike the Herzlian European Zionism, which in response to the pogroms of the 19th century in particular and the state-sanctioned violence, because Sephardi Jews didn't really experience those forms of state-sanctioned violence, as a result, they rarely encouraged the idea of a separate state of Jewish people, and rather perceived themselves to have Palestine as a space for Jewish cultural regeneration, but still under the administration of the Ottoman Empire. And then finally you have who I call provincial nationalists, and not in the like negative terminology of like, oh, they're provincial and like uneducated, but rather people who aren't who don't live in Anatolia or Greece and are rather Arab. And so men like Joseph Kadawi Pasha, or women such as Esther Moyal, who saw themselves in a broader Arab national context and not in an Ottoman context, because they viewed the Ottomans as imperialists, just as they viewed the British or the French as imperialists. And so as all of these groups move into into the nation state, as empires collapse after World War I, you see actually, instead of continuing burgeoning opportunities for Jews to be a part of the empire, they instead feel greater restraints. And so I want to close with a quote by Aaron Rodrigue, who's a scholar on Ottoman on Ottoman Sephardi Jews. And he writes that if you are a minority, it is much better to be one amongst multiple minorities and not the only minority. And so if you're in the Ottoman situation with lots and lots of other groups, you are not the only other. And thus, once you move into the nation state and you're the only minority, it can only mean trouble, because you become the other and you become the repository of all the fantasies that people can have about non-majority groups. And so hence, in the by the time of the post-1945 context, you see in countries such as Turkey, for example, where 40% of their Jewish population leaves immediately in 1948 because of this idea that they're native foreigners, that they actually don't belong to the state, and because of the state formation of Israel, that they should really go there, and that they're not actually Turkish. And likewise, you see this as time goes on in Arab nations as well, yet when they arrive in Israel in the Euro-Zionist context, they're not really seen as truly Jewish because they didn't experience the state-sanctioned violence of the pogroms of the 19th century, nor did they necessarily experience the Holocaust. And so, unfortunately, I leave you on that very sad note, but I hope you at least got a little taste of complex Ottoman Jewish dynamics in the 19th century, and I look forward to your questions. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. My name's Jake Hudson Humphrey. I'm a philosophy and religious studies major, and my thesis is titled Mystical Experience and Epistemic Injustice. Before I talk about my thesis, I would like to thank my reader, Professor Kind, for all of her help throughout the process, and Priya for having me here. So in my thesis, I explored questions of knowledge, communication, and understanding, which surround mystical experiences by applying Miranda Fricker's framework of epistemic injustice to situations where someone who has had a mystical experience tries to share their knowledge about it with someone who is not. So it's okay if that didn't make any sense. I'm going to go through what sort of led me to my topic and hopefully clarified the parts of that summary. So first, I was interested in investigating what information or knowledge can be gained from an experience that can't be gained in any other way. So this was sparked by this book, Transformative Experience by L.A. Paul, that I read in Professor Kine's class. This book got me interested in experiences which can't be understood or imagined by someone who's not had the experience. So Paul uses this hypothetical example of someone who can't see color, and so there's no way for this person to know what it would be like to see color based on the experiences that she has already had. In contrast, if she were considering running a marathon, she might correctly think that because she's run a 5K, she can imagine what a marathon will be like. So we call this knowledge that's gained only from experience knowledge about what something is like or about what its likeness. So second, my interest in religion led me to consider mystical experiences as a possible site to investigate these questions. And there's no single scholarly definition of a mystical experience, but the criteria that I came to use in my thesis was that it's difficult to adequately describe in words, that it imparts the what it's like knowledge onto the experiencer, that it involves a feeling of transcendence of space, time, and the self, and that it's transformative in that the individual undergoes significant change in who she is, what she knows, or what she thinks is good, moral, or important. So these mystical experiences have been reported across time and place and can happen spontaneously through practices like meditation or as an effect of psychedelic medicines used in or out of religious contexts. As a subset of these mystical experiences, I focused on those in which there is primarily this loss of the sense of self and this loss of the division between the subject and the world around her. So that is temporarily lost sort of in the way that when you're a kid, when you're very young, you haven't formed your self-concept and you haven't differentiated yourself from the world around you. So I chose to focus on this because I think it interestingly parallels the difficulty we have in imagining what it would be like to have never seen color. I think it's equally hard to try to imagine what it would be like to not have the sense of self that we go through our everyday lives sort of relying on. So third, after reading Miranda Fricker's book, Epistemic Injustice, in Professor Martin's philosophy seminar, I became interested in Fricker's framework for talking about how someone can be harmed in their capacity as a knower, so as a possessor of knowledge. And when we combine the idea of a transformative experience with that of a mystical experience, we can imagine that the person who has had this mystical experience occupies a unique position. So there's knowledge that she's gained from her experience that can only be gained through that experience. The experience was life-changing and thus led her to want to share it with others. Yet her attempts to share that knowledge usually fail, and I get into that more in the thesis and later on. So I argue that epistemic injustice occurs here, that the experiencer is not recognized as a knower because the experience is so unimaginable to someone who has not had it that it is akin to someone telling you that they can suddenly see a new color, or telling someone who has never seen color, in the hypothetical example, what red is like or what a color is like. So there would be no way for you to understand or imagine this experience until you have it yourself, and this imaginative inaccessibility might lead you to deny that person's claim. You might think that the person is lying to you or is crazy or deluded, and thereby reject that the person has valid knowledge. So after building up some background information, as hopefully I just did, my paper focused on this last part, which was the failure to recognize someone as a knower because of the type of knowledge they have and are trying to communicate. So I investigated how this might be a new domain for the application of Fricker's framework and what that might teach us about our biases surrounding knowledge. It was exciting for me to see how this new type of experience could be understood through Fricker's framework. Ultimately, it didn't fit as well as the cases that Fricker relies on in her work. But I found this to be sort of an equally valuable part of the process because it allowed me to understand this philosopher's argument better by seeing how my case did and did not line up with it. So for me, the hardest part about this whole process was trying to figure out how to talk about experiences that are definitionally hard to talk about. That was one of my criteria, was that it's hard to put into words. So I ended up dedicating a few pages to just reprinting the accounts of these people, their accounts of their experiences, because these accounts shed light on both the desire to communicate them, this intense sense of importance to their lives, and simultaneously the difficulty in communicating them. And I would love to share these with anyone who's interested later, but there's not really time. And then if I were to give advice to younger students, philosophy students perhaps, it would be to take a risk in your choice of topic. I think it was stressful to try to bring together these diverse materials, and it wasn't quite as comfortable as sort of an old philosophical problem that's been tackled many times, or working with an old text. So that sort of, as others have said, produced some like feelings of imposter syndrome and all of that. And I was convinced that, this was all nonsense and that it would never come together into anything. But then it did. So that was a valuable lesson in like academic self-confidence, I guess, and risk-taking. There's certainly things I would change if I were to do it again, but I am proud of my work and everything that I learned along the way. So, yeah, thank you for listening. I'm sorry I didn't have any music or slides.
I guess, yeah,
huge oversight.
Okay, I'd like to ask it. I was going to ask a question.
So how do you distinguish between mystical experiences that are credible and sources of knowledge that just can't be appreciated and crazy people?
So I was focusing on the what it's likeness, which allowed me to skirt some of those questions, because by focusing on the knowledge that is gained about what the experience is like, I don't have to address whether that claim accurately represents reality or whether the person is crazy or whatever. So by focusing on the experiential component and the what it's likeness of the experience of, in this case, the loss of self-other differentiation, I could focus more on the experiential knowledge rather than the propositional knowledge. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Danielle, and my thesis title is "The More They're Beaten, the Better They Be." That actually comes from a 19th century British proverb. That's the complete thing is, a spaniel, a walnut tree, and a woman. The more they're beaten, the better they be. And I am focusing on gendered violence and abuse in Victorian laws and literature. So first, before I begin, I wanted to say thank you so much, Priya, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. And I want to just say that my thesis journey wasn't something I traveled alone, and I think for all seniors who complete a thesis, you're not alone in this. Even though you're technically the only student in your thesis class, there are so many people along the way who help you out. And I really want to thank my readers, Professor Cody and Professor Crockett, for all their guidance and support. And I also wanted to thank all the professors I've had so far at CMC. I've learned so much in terms of how to research and how to write that I think really influenced the way that I approached my thesis project. So I just wanted to add that I'm going to approach this a little bit differently. I really wanted to give you a tour of my brain and tell you what went on and what went into my thought process when it came to this thesis. So originally, this project was a final research paper that I had completed for Professor Cody's class. There was a topic where we got to explore Old Bailey criminal court proceedings, which the Old Bailey is a digital archive which contains criminal court cases from 1674 to 1913, and it's London's Central Criminal Court. So you have everything in there from stealing a pet to high crimes against the state. So you'll find so many criminal court cases there, and it was a lot of fun to look through. I perused through murder cases, and I found one that interested me, not because of the murder itself, but because of the ways that gender attitudes really played into it. So this is just a quote from Anne Merritt. She was a witness in a case that John Merritt, who was indicted for the murder of his wife, Sarah Parrott. The parts that I bolded are the parts that really stood out to me. So she says that they lived together on very bad terms. She often heard screams and cries of murder from the deceased. I just want to add that it wasn't only on that day that she had heard screams. It was repeated. As long as she had lived there, she had heard violence occurring in their part of the home. And you'll also find that in the Old Bailey, anything that was an expletive was redacted. Victorians did not want those expletives to be in the proceedings. And then she ends with, "He was abusing her." And I found this very interesting because I wanted to know how domestic violence, how spousal abuse, how intimate partner abuse was seen by the Victorians. How did they imagine it? Were these even crimes? So this case dealt with working class Victorians, and they all lived in the same home structure. So I wanted to know how was spatiality constructed? What was private? What was public? How did you delineate public versus private spaces? So that brings me to my thesis. So obviously in a 10-page paper, I couldn't answer all those questions. So once I started thinking about my thesis project, I really wanted to get back to this final paper which had such an impact on me. The research I had begun really became the basis for this project, but it expanded in ways that I never anticipated, such as Victorian era artwork that honestly had a lot to say about Victorian attitudes towards women. So abuse in Victorian legal terms. So domestic violence, that actually wasn't a crime and it didn't exist in the Old Bailey. If you look through the criminal court records, that wasn't considered a crime. The closest category I could discern was the category known as sex crimes, and these were the crimes that were included in the Old Bailey. So bigamy, keeping a brothel, or procuring indecent assault, rape, and other miscellaneous sexual offenses. I specifically wanted to focus on rape, and I thought that I would find a lot of interesting testimony in the rape category that could tell me a lot about how Victorians approached that. So the Victorian definition of rape was based in an Elizabethan statute that was highly gendered and it specifically defined rape with a male perpetrator and a female victim. Also required that the evidence was required to prove that the rape had occurred. So often rape cases were reduced to assault with the intent to rape just because of the lack of evidence, and it was really hard to get a conviction. So rape was also not applicable to married couples because under coverture law, women's legal rights were legally absorbed into that of her husband, so it was impossible to try a man for raping his wife. So prior to 1841, rape was a capital offense, so you see that conviction rates fell as low to 5% because of the fact that it was tried as a capital crime. But after 1841, when it was no longer a capital crime, the conviction rate significantly increases. So I thought this was really interesting, and going forward, I wanted to see what witnesses had to say, what were the facts of the crime, but I ran into a problem. There was a bump in my thesis road, which occurred early on, thankfully. I found that these crimes, or the transcripts of these crimes, were considered unfit for publication. So basically, the Old Bailey only had a few facts of the case, so who is the accused, and their verdict. So it didn't really help me to just know who these people were. I really wanted to know what was going on in the cases, so I had to figure out what to do. So how'd I overcome this obstacle? So I also am a history and a literature major, so I turned to literary sources, which was so much fun, and in a great way I got to combine my love of history and my love of literature. So this was just one of the novels that I used. So Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. You have The Mad Woman in the Attic, Bertha Mason. The famous last lines of this novel are, "Reader, I married him." And I was always struck by that because I'm like, you're marrying the man who had a woman locked in his attic for a bunch of years. Not very romantic to me, but this was also a path with its own complications. I found that the representations of women in abuse varied across literary sources. So you had Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, who you have Nancy, who's an abused woman, but she's also a prostitute. She lives on the streets of London. She's abused by, she's also involved in petty crime and thievery. And then you have Bertha, who she's a wife of an elite man who's confined in her home and has been for many years. And there's a lot of mental discourse that's involved in her confinement. So what I could do and what I did is I looked at spatiality. And I found that women, depending on what space they were in, that related to the way that they were seen by society. So I started off in the home, the angel in the home. I looked at abuse in the domestic space. I specifically looked at divorce laws. And actually, there are a few literary sources that deal with spousal rape, even though the law did not. Then I looked at the mad woman. I looked at the ways that confinement, I looked at lunacy laws, and the ways that mental disease was perceived by Victorians. And then finally, I looked at the fallen women. So these are women who were perceived to be prostitutes, women who lived on the streets, mostly working class women. And I looked at the way that modernity, city life versus rural, interacted to create this Victorian attitude that surrounded them and their bodies, and the ways that Victorians did police their bodies. So placing the law with the literature was key to unlocking the ideas I wanted to explore. And really quickly, here's a sample of how I analyzed my sources. So I was looking at genital mutilation and association with moral disease in the Victorian age in this section. And I looked at a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle, The Case of Lady Sannox. And in this story, a woman's lip is mutilated, and it's seen as a moral corrective to a mental disease. And then I got into a lot of medical discourse. There's actually a lot written about women and gender and just mental disease. It was seen as biological. So when you're treating nymphomania, it was seen that you could treat it biologically. And clitorectomies were an acceptable practice, were justifiable where other means fail. So Victorians, through like a symbolic representation of her lip, that was also symbolic of the clitorectomy, which was an actual treatment. So I looked at mutilation cases from the Old Bailey, which many were considered unfit for publication. So that was also a barrier, but at the same time, the literature came and it saved the day in the ways that the law sort of did not. And connections to today. So as I was writing my thesis, I was very much influenced by what was going on today. And you'll find that the law, gender, and gender are constantly interacting. And so this is actually from yesterday. I saw this on BBC News. So France has handed out 447 fines in the first 8 months of having an anti-harassment law. And then upskirting this month was declared a crime in England, and offenders face up to 2 years in jail. And then Christine Blasey Ford, she was named to Time's 100 most influential persons of 2019. So as I was writing this thesis, I found that, history is set in its moment, but it's also very much contemporary, and you can see a lot of social attitudes reflected today. And thanks for listening.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Oh, thank you.
What was the most interesting Old Bailey case that you found?
The most interesting Old Bailey case that I found, this one's kind of sad. So a lot of them are really sad. So a man was charged with mutilation. It was a mutilation case. He was charged with mutilating his wife's face. It was said that he was drunk, according to witnesses, but then he accused his wife of being drunk that day. And in addition, he also said that that was the first time that had ever occurred. So instead of being charged with the mutilation, which carried a heavier sentence, he was just charged with an indecent assault, which only carried a sentence, I think, of 3 years of confinement. Yeah, I just thought it was interesting the ways that kind of women are portrayed either as like complete victims, like the complete angel, or if they're like demonized, which commonly was through alcohol, like related stuff. So if she was drunk, that often was associated with other moral vices. So either she was completely the angel or she was demonized. And in those ways, you can definitely see the law and kind of gender attitudes in tension with each other. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much for coming. I know this is a longer than usual evening, but it's great to have you here. And I think we, another round of applause for our great presenters. So interesting.